Good morning. I'm Kimberly Charrington, the Director of Operations here at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, or NIDS. And I want to welcome each of you to today's seminar, Russia's Evolving Tactical and Theater Nuclear Posture with Dr. Phillip Karber. Dr. Karber is a professor of strategy and praxis at the National Defense University. He holds degrees from Pepperdine and Georgetown, PhD in international law, with postdoctoral certificates from Harvard Kennedy School, Wharton, and Harvard Business School. A former U.S. Marine, Dr. Karber began his national security career in 1968 under Admiral Burke, advising on tactical nuclear weapons. He later directed the NSSM 186 net assessment of the military balance in Europe and served as strategy advisor to the Secretary of Defense and chairman of the Joint Chiefs. At the Cold War's end, he led the only DoD initiative to interview senior Soviet military leaders on the views of the strategic outcomes. We are honored to have you here, Dr. Karber. And just a reminder, in 2 weeks from today, we will host Dr. Don Cook, who will be addressing strategic stockpile stewardship. To find all of our upcoming events and register you and your colleagues, or read our publications or listen to our podcast, please go to thinkdeterrence.com. We are adding new speakers and content weekly, so be sure to check back and follow us on social media so you don't miss out. If you or your colleagues would like to be added to our invitation list, please email us at nids@thinkdeterrence.com. Now, during today's presentation, we encourage you to submit your questions at any time in the chat or at the Q&A button at the top of the screen, and we will address those during the Q&A portion of today's talk. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our host for today's seminar, the acclaimed Mr. Peter Huessy, President and Senior Director of Strategic Deterrence Studies at Geostrategic Analysis and a Senior Fellow here at NIDS. Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kimberly. I want to welcome our President, Jim Petrovsky, is here today, and also our honored guest, Phil Karber. What I wanted Phil to talk about today is, we often talk about the nuclear stockpile that Russia may have, and we talk about their START-related or New START-related forces, but we often forget a force that's even greater in number than their deployed START-accountable weapons, and that is their theater or regional nuclear weapons. It's often dismissed that, well, they're the same as strategic, and the question is, Phil's going to go through what Russia has, what do they have them for, what is the threat, why should we be concerned, and possible U.S. reactions. So I want to thank you, Phil. Been some time since we talked last, but always enjoy your remarks and always learn an enormous amount. So on behalf of NIDS and our audience and the sponsors we have today, I want to thank you for joining us, and over to you, sir.
Thank you, Peter. It's great to be here. Let me start off by saying that since I'm on furlough, I'm not speaking for either the National Defense University or the U.S. government. The views I'm expressing are my own. And I'd like to thank the Potomac Foundation because they provided the research assistance to have a number of researchers pull a lot of the data together that I'm going to show today. So thank you very much. Kimberly, if you throw the first, the next slide, please. What I'd like to address is the non-strategic arsenal of Russia, and it runs the gamut from nuclear artillery all the way up to long-range theater systems, which have strategic consequences for those who are inside their coverage envelope. And one of the things that's interesting about these weapons is that the vast majority of them are dual capable. On the one hand, that seems like it's a great idea. It's efficient, so you don't have to have a separate assets dedicated solely to nuclear weapons. And it it gives a lot of flexibility to both your operators and your strategists. On the other hand, the reason I put versus frustration in the slide is at two levels, dual capability can be a serious challenge. For the crews that are operating them, it means double work. And there's all kinds of issues related to surety and security. And the margin of error for dealing with the nuclear weapons, no matter how small, is much smaller than with traditional military assets. So it creates a real problem in terms of traditional military organizations who want to get on with doing what they feel best at. They haven't fought a nuclear war, or even a lot of them haven't even thought about it. So it seems like it's odd as sort of as a diversion. On the other hand, are the politicians or senior leaders who are concerned about having lots of loose nukes running around. Jack Kennedy during the Berlin crisis specifically expressed that concern. So dual capability is a bonus and also a challenge. I'm going to go through each of these areas, and then Peter had asked me to give this lecture last spring. If I had then, I would have been much more circumspect, because things have happened since the spring that are even beyond my wildest imagination in terms of concerns that I would have had then. So things are moving at a relatively rapid pace. So, and I believe that they sort of came to a head last month during the Russian Zapad exercises and their introduction of nuclear weapons into Belarus, and also the drone activity and airspace violations that have been both preceded and been following since Zapad. And lastly, I want to raise some concerns about NATO's nuclear deterrent posture. Next slide, please. I'm going to start with some fairly simple issues to those who are in the business. But one of the reasons why I wanted to emphasize it is those of us who deal with this on a daily basis or have thought about it a lot. We tend to talk in our own jargon. We tend to be aware of our world. But the many people outside that world, people who are making critical decisions about resources, about support, if they hear the word nuclear weapon, they think all nuclear weapons are alike. I think there's a number of issues that get raised here that need to be clarified. Also, we're in the spot that we're in because in 1991, following was clearly Russian withdrawal from Eastern Europe, damn near collapse of the Russian economy, the concerns about Russia even being able to control its own nuclear arsenal. President Bush, with Colin Powell and Brent Scowcroft encouraging him, proposed, and Gorbachev went along with it, to have the mutual unilateral reduction of non-central systems, mainly tactical and theater systems. There had already been some success with the INF Treaty, getting rid of the SS-20 in exchange for the Pershings and Glickham. So this sort of seen in a way seemed natural. What was weird is the way it was done. It wasn't really negotiated. It wasn't really an arms control agreement. There's no verification and there's no commitment. It's just each side declares that they're going to reduce their nuclear arsenal. We went from something on the order of something like 5,000 tactical and theater weapons down to several hundred. The Russians went from something on the order of 20,000 down to about 5,000 over the next 10, 12 years. So huge reduction on both sides, but it was asymmetrical. We got rid of nuclear artillery. We got rid of virtually all naval nuclear weapons. We got rid of a lot of extended range weapons, and we're left with essentially air-delivered gravity bombs, B-61. We spent a lot of money modernizing the B-61, giving it variable yields, but primarily making it safer and more secure. The Russians spent a lot of effort, as we'll see, developing not only new systems but also new warheads. So what's interesting is this asymmetrical reduction is sort of left us where we are. We'll come back to it at the end. As I said, we tend to think all nuclear weapons are the same, and in a way, the basic principles are. But the difference between the smallest tactical nuclear weapon and the largest nuclear weapon in either superpower's inventory, I'm not talking about Tsar Bomba, but operational inventory, is 1 million. So the smallest is down at 20 tons and the largest is at 20 megatons. And we need to appreciate what that difference is because it's significant. And I'll go through some of these points in the next couple of slides. I apologize if it seems simplistic or telling everybody what they already know, but I think even though we know it, it's important to kind of educate others about it. Next slide. So we've all seen the charts about the number of central strategic systems or the total number of warheads the two sides had. What's sort of interesting about it is in non-strategic systems, the U.S. had put a major effort in designing, developing, and deploying tactical and theater nuclear weapons in the 50s. We were significantly ahead. We had, and the Russians found it harder because, first of all, they were trying to build up their strategic forces. They had problems reaching continental United States. Miniaturization was a major issue. So they had about a 20-year lag between when we had them and they felt inferior to their posture at the peak of the Cold War. When we signed on to the mutual reduction, they had we were already down to about a third of similar systems, and so they had a lot more, and this took them longer, and it generally kept a larger number. I have the question mark there for the last 10, 12 years because outside of the government, it's hard to get data. And in fact, I was in one quick war story. At the end of the Cold War, I was doing an advance in Moscow with Carlucci, and he sent me out to be with the strategic rocket guys, and we were talking about the Nunn-Lugar proposal to have containers for warheads. These two 3-stars in the rocket forces, they didn't want to be there. They were not happy about the way things were going at the end of the Cold War. So we were talking about it, and they said, well, we don't have anything like that. It might be interesting. So I said, well, how many do you think you would need? And they said, well, we need about 40,000. And I asked, well, but wait a minute, if you're going to keep several thousand warheads, why do you need 2 of these protective containers per warhead? And they looked at me like I was talking Greek. And they said, no, we have 40-some thousand warheads. I said, you can't. I briefed the president of the United States on it. I mean, at the height of the Cold War, with all of our intelligence, we missed a fairly large number, about 15,000 that they had. Not all of them were certainly operational. Some of them were. I even asked them. I said, some of these are for old systems. You don't even have the delivery system for them. Yeah, I know. So why don't you recover the material? Oh, it's too expensive. It's kind of dangerous. You never know. We might need them, so we just put them away. So my point about that is it is very hard to use national means to identify how many nuclear weapons people have. And I think it is prudent to recognize not only a high level of uncertainty, but a serious amount of entropy in terms of and be humble about numbers when we throw them around. Next slide. So this shows the evolution of our non-strategic. Ours is in blue. The reason I have the yellow there in line is 2013, Dr. Joe Braddock, who was a longtime boss and also a close friend, founder of the Potomac Foundation, and I had a session with Sergei Rogov and some Russian generals. It was a fairly honest discussion, and in fact, I never found them being deceitful or dishonest. There's times they would say, "I won't answer that question." One of the generals told us, we said, "Well, we have about 5,000 non-strategic warheads," and he said 3,000 are in deep reserve and storage, and we have 2,050. Well, 2,050 was kind of a weird number. And so I said, "You mean 2,500? And he goes, "No, I mean 2,050. And these are modern warheads." So if I put that number in on this chart, that would be the what's in the blue or sort of purplish color, and the yellow is the questions about, well, how much do they still have 3,000 warheads in deep storage, or have they gotten rid of them? So where do they go? So forth and so on. So there's a significant level of ambiguity. It makes a difference because if you look at the delta between what could be the top of the purple line and the blue line, there's a potentially big difference. I'm not saying that I know. I'm just raising the question. Next slide, please. It's easy to demonize people in these kinds of debates. So I thought I went to look at Bolton Atomic Scientist and the work of Hans Christensen. And I think he's an honest workman. And like anybody going through this material, you have to make assumptions. And he's very explicit about his assumptions, which is useful instead of just throwing numbers around. But it's sort of interesting using his numbers for Russia. It comes out with about 1,400. I noticed in going through the categories that he ignored nuclear artillery. And in the discussion with the Russian generals now 12 years ago, they had said they had over 1,000 nuclear artillery shells. So that, I don't think they got completely wiped out that inventory. On the other side is ours, and basically we're down to a relatively small number of B-61 bombs. I am not one to say that a disparity in numbers automatically has either political or strategic significance. But if you use Hans's numbers, it would be 7-1. If you stuck my numbers in for nuclear artillery, it would be 10-1 difference in non-strategic nuclear weapons. And at some point, you begin to say, well, how does that impact on your options, your confidence? Does it give, what does the opponent feel? Does he feel more emboldened to push you around? So it's an interesting question, and we'll come back to it. Next slide. So not all nuclear weapons are alike. The chart on your left shows it shows essentially for with examples. I certainly didn't list every warhead in our inventory or theirs, but shows a range of delivery systems or warheads that went with different delivery systems. And like I said, the smallest was 20 tons and the largest 20 megatons. You say, well, what is that? What's the difference? Well, the explosive power of the two planes hitting the World Trade Center was roughly 20 tons worth of explosive, if you put them together. And that's kind of a reasonable representation of what a 20-ton warhead does. On the other hand, when you overlay it 20 megatons, it's a completely different universe. And the difference is, like I said, 1 million times in explosive yield. And it raises it challenges the issue of whether having lower yield nuclear weapons has some value. And we'll come back to that. Next slide. Well, the examples on the left, just again highlighting the phenomenology. The phenomenology of the nuclear explosions are not the same at the ends of the spectrum. Big yields have not only big effects, but they have literally earth-shaking consequences in terms of the amount of fires, blowdown, material, radiation, and so forth. On the other hand, at the lower end, because the effects of nuclear weapons are attenuated by the atmosphere, with radiation attenuated to the cube, where blast and shock, blast and fire are to the square. As you get down into the lower yields, prompt radiation has an effect. But relatively quickly as you go up in yield, it becomes irrelevant because blast and shock will already quickly overtake those effects. But I thought the two illustrations on the left are also interesting. They're basically taken from the same distance. One's a 15 kiloton warhead, and the other's I think it was 22 ton warhead. So one, you get the big mushroom cloud, you get a lot of shock effect. The other, you see a bright light. So it is really radically different. Next slide. So we'll go through the systems. I already sort of mentioned the dual capable. So the best example of dual capability is dual capable artillery. Next slide. So, like I said, we got rid of all of our nuclear artillery. I believe the Chief of Staff of the Army actually went and begged President Bush not to get rid of everything, at least keep one brigade, and the feeling was, no, let's just get rid of it. I don't know what happened. At one point, the Navy was going to store ASW warheads, but my impression is that they've gone away, but that may be because I don't know. The Russians have been modernizing their nuclear artillery. That behemoth at the top, they built, actually only deployed 4 of them. And as I said earlier, they were behind in miniaturization, and they thought that, so they said, okay, we'll make up for the difficulties we have in miniaturizing for and the accuracy for that artillery provides with bigger is better. So we put a bigger warhead on a Frog or a Scud, a free rocket or a missile. So for 20 years, they basically we had nuclear artillery and we were modernizing it. And because of that, we moved to NATO's concept of flexible response under the assumption that if we were being faced with a massive conventional attack that we can no longer hold the front, we could initiate nuclear fire on our territory, which would prevent their massing and hopefully keep a breakthrough from happening. By the 70s, but actually late 60s, the Russians began realizing, because they were at that point going head to head with the Chinese on Ussuri, they began identifying the value of having accurate, low-yield weapons to offset an opponent who has the advantage of conventional mass. So they began developing and fielding first with towed artillery, but then relatively quickly took those towed tubes and put them, wrapped them around a tracked armored vehicle. The advantage of a self-propelled artillery, and by the way, every system on here that's listed has, or almost everyone, has a towed equivalent. And there's nothing that keeps you from firing a nuclear warhead out of a towed gun. And they're cheaper. The advantage of having self-propelled is you can rapidly displace, you can fire and move and scoot. And so it reduces your own vulnerability to a counterfire. As been shown in Ukraine, towed artillery, the crews are very vulnerable to counterfire. The tubes and the towed systems, just basically steel, tend to have a pretty good survivability, and if you have a tire that's shot out, you can replace the tire and so forth. With self-propelled artillery, it's much more complex, and when it gets hit, it tends to be more catastrophic, not only to the vehicle, but to the crew. So this was the Russians. The third system down from the top was interesting. The Russians were having trouble. They wanted to kind of mimic enhanced radiation warhead development. And so, but again, they had the problem of miniaturization. So they found it easier. So they brought out an old 240 mortar, which actually had initially a very short range. But it gave them the room to be able to have a warhead design that they could actually manufacture. It later then developed a wraparound. So that you'll notice that's the one system on here that we have strong reason to believe has an ER warhead. Whether the others do or not, or have gotten them, I don't know. The difference between the dark and the lighter color on those bars is generally having a rocket-assisted projectile, or in one case, having the specially designed shell that gives extended range. And there's a range of yields from reasonably large all the way down to 20 tons. Next slide. So along with the development of the systems, the Russians also were building new warheads. We were building them as well. I was involved in the 8-inch enhanced radiation warhead, and then the efforts to develop the improved 155. Ours ended up being either held back for political reasons, or the program didn't happen by the time of the end of the Cold War. Russians have been having a systematic effort to have new warheads. The photo there on the far left is the 20-ton shell for their 152. Next slide, please. So the tactical advantages, if you use a large, everything's relative. If you use something in the a kiloton range, lower kiloton range on the battlefield, it's still messy. The bigger the yield, the more dirt material you kick up, which means then gets produces radiation fallout. You create a tree blowdown. You got burning villages, and it's hard. It's interesting in most of the exercises I've participated in over the years. When both sides have that size weapon and are using it in fairly significant numbers, you end up not getting blitzkrieg, but sitzkrieg. If you have low yield nuclear weapons in the less than a kiloton, you can use them much more discreetly. You don't have a lot of the secondary effects, and it allows you to be able to maneuver. It's interesting. I remember talking to a Soviet general when we were doing the interviews at the end of the Cold War. And his argument was if both sides have nuclear weapons, it's sort of like if both sides have chemical, it just makes a mess of the battlefield. But it is decisive when one side has them and the other side doesn't. And he was using both the example of chemical and from the World War I Eastern Front and also modern day tactical nuclear weapons. Next slide, please. Russians have lost a lot of artillery in Ukraine. These numbers, by the way, are relatively conservative. I've seen numbers as high as 3 times those totals. But even these numbers that are pretty confirmable or reasonable and based on a lot of evidence, they basically have lost in numbers the inventory they started the campaign in Ukraine in 2022 with. Now, they had other artillery and other active units, special artillery brigades. They had stuff stored in resupply units, and they certainly had a lot of cold storage. I saw a recent analysis done on overhead, which shows that basically much of the stored areas of artillery are now empty. Not all the systems that are damaged are destroyed, so they can be recovered and parts cannibalized. The problem that Russians have is they have only 4 major plants that can actually do that work, and it's just time consuming. So it would take years to replace and these kinds of losses. It's the same with new production. Next slide. So they still have about 30% by my estimate, of their nuclear capable assets. Air is also a significant non-strategic asset, ranging from the Tu-122M bomber, and particularly now with long-range standoff missiles, which can greatly increase its own range, or reduce its necessity to penetrate defenses and thus be vulnerable as a carrier. So that is a development that is relatively new within the last few years, and it appears to have a major significance. The TU can carry 4 of those long-range missiles. The new Su-34, which is a good strike aircraft, excellent strike aircraft. It'd be better if it was stealthy, but other than that, it performed well. It carries 1, and the MiG-31 carries 1 of those missiles. The older Su-24, which the Fencer, which the Su-34 replaced, used essentially a gravity bomb or a chute retarded bomb for delivery. I put the MiG-29 and I think that should be Su-30 on there because those planes do have the hard points, and they have been used for, according to the Russian generals that I spoke to, again, more than a decade ago, they could be used for nuclear delivery, at least one bomb per plane or something. The reason I put it here, and I should have shown it on the other slide too, is the other slide, two of those nuclear artillery systems are in the inventory of Belarus. And also these two are in these two aircraft in orange or in Belarus. Next slide. The Russian air losses have not been as significant as the artillery. They took particularly heavy losses in the early days, and basically now aren't flying either over the battlefield or even deep, but doing air delivered missiles. In total, they've lost 80 of these nuclear capable aircraft, but still have a number left. Next slide. The Russians have been going into a wide range of missiles. I mean, it is really surprising. And they're not only development, bright ideas, but actually being deployed. And they range from being able to carry a thermonuclear warhead all the way down to a tactical. It's sort of interesting. The S-300, SA-10 air defense missile has the capability. It is as the S-400 as well, has a nuclear capability, and it can be used in a ground-to-ground ballistic trajectory. In fact, it's been used considerably in Ukraine. And when you look at these numbers, over 3,000 Iskander missiles have been fired. Over 2,000 air-launched Kirzal, 300 Navy-launched Caliber. I mean, it's a phenomenal amount. I don't know, but I would suspect that if one looked at our estimates of what their inventory was back in 2022, our numbers of them having that many reserve missiles would not have been anywhere near that number. Next slide. I was going to go through the Cold War exercises, but time is passing us by, so I'm just going to summarize this very quickly. One of the key points that Russia has tended to do when they're trying to work out their own military doctrine, not just nuclear, but nuclear conventional, and particularly in theater, is the Zapad exercise. Zapad means West. They were introduced in '69. They had a whole series of Cold War exercises. Then at the end of the Cold War, they went away for 15 years. In 1999, Putin had three innovations. One, he brought back the Zapad exercise. Two, he supported the concept of escalate to de-escalate. And I'll describe that briefly in a minute. And third, he started rebuilding the Russian army and also trying to modernize it. And the most recent of the Zapad exercises was this year, and I'll talk about it very briefly. Next slide. So in the middle of the Zapad exercise, it's the first exercise in that long list, which was almost exclusively based around nuclear weapons. Yeah, they had a couple of conventional bombing shows and some rifle shooting, but even troops doing normal, just tactical exercises, unusually a large number were in chem bio gear and so forth. One of the things that came about with this nuclearization, and part of the reason, by the way, is the Russians could only afford to send 2 brigades for it, where usually they would have several armies participating. Up to 100,000 men. But they used it as the opportunity to bring nuclear warheads forward into Belarus and integrate the Belarusian military into the Russian military to the point where they're actually bringing Belarusian troops to Russia and training them for the nuclear capable systems they have, including the Iskander and the S-300, not to mention the air and the nuclear artillery. And as part of Zapad, they brought forth the new Orshenk hypervelocity missile. And you don't see this mentioned very much, or frankly, I don't remember seeing it at all. We spent a major part of from the 79 to the mid 80s worrying about the SS-20 threat to Europe. And we had lots of stuff that led to the deployment of Pershing and Glickham. This system is the SS-20 on steroids. And yet we haven't had hardly any discussion. And it's dual capable. In both versions, apparently, it can have up to 6 independently targeted warheads as well. And it was used at least once on Ukraine. Next slide. Russians have been hitting Ukraine with massive amounts of drones. It's hard to see the yellow in there is the missile firings on the top of the bars. Now you see there's a Zapad exercise which was sandwiched between the 2 of the largest drone usages a couple of days before and a couple of days after, and along with some other drone fun. Next slide.
Jesus.
A couple of days after Zapad, in one of the larger attacks on Ukraine, the Russians launched over 400 drones, and some of those drones ended up in Poland. There have been various commentators say, "Oh well, you know, the Ukrainians are using electronic warfare, so they probably just messed up the guidance, and so they just flew off and ended up in Poland," or that. It wasn't intentional. It was just an accident. So I spent quite a bit of time going through this and actually tracking the flight paths of each of them. And what it shows is this was not a random or an accident, and it wasn't an effect of electronic warfare. The drones were under live command and actually would maneuver when confronted, for example, in Poland by opposing aircraft. They came from 3 command centers on the border of Ukraine, and had individual flight paths. Next slide. And by the way, it was mixed with caliber, air-launched cruise missiles, and Iskander strikes, all in the same day. Next slide. So when I saw that Orshenk missile getting in its speed and its capability, I sort of thought, well, maybe we ought to take a look at NATO's nuclear deterrent. It's changed since the old days when we had 7,000 nuclear weapons in Europe, when we had them in 10 or 15 different types of delivery systems. Now it's down to a handful of air bases, about 50 aircraft, about somewhere around 100. I'm not going to argue one way or the other. You could add you could double the number. But a relatively small number of forward deployed nuclear weapons. And like I said, it's essentially the B-61 bomb. Those bases are semi-hard in the sense they have shelters for the warheads, some shelters for the planes. But they are extremely vulnerable to both being suppressed conventionally, or if hit with preemptive nuclear weapons, or even if not preemptive, just hit with nuclear weapons in the middle of a conflict. Next slide. So what difference does all these new systems the Russians have been pouring in make? A lot. The air-delivered missiles at great depth, the movement of more Iskanders forward, and particularly that long-range killer. Next slide. So I said, just to characterize the difference between NATO's concept of flexible response or graduated deterrence, some people call, we were going to try and defend conventionally. If that failed, we were going to initiate nuclear fire. If they then came back and it got messy, we would have deliberate escalation, and in the end, it would go all the way to general nuclear response. I actually participated in that in a proud prophet with the secretary, and the only simulation of U.S. war plans ever conducted by the Secretary of Defense and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and trying to make that strategy work. Challenging. And the Russian antidote for it was to try to make it difficult for us to do those steps by having a strong preemptive conventional front end that would mess up our the ease by which we could initiate nuclear fire. What is escalate to de-escalate? Completely different concept. It's not graduated, and it recognizes deterrence for what deterrence is. It is not necessarily just a material pile of stuff. It's in the mind of the opponent. So escalate to de-escalate assumes that one can identify the decision logic of the opponent and target that. In some cases, just rattling a nuclear weapon may be enough to get people to fold, or a demonstration strike. In some cases, it goes much bigger. In the Zapad exercise of 1999, the Russians played use of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield, taking out the Vishal bridges for keep NATO from coming to the aid of the Baltics. And then just for the hell of it, hit Warsaw with a 1 megaton warhead. But that was escalate to de-escalate. Next slide. So this is, I apologize, a quick run through. We could spend hours going through it. I was more interested in trying to, rather than reveal truth, rather say, pose some dissonant information to ask, do we have a competitive problem in non-strategic nuclear forces? And I'm asking that. So in the discussion, I hope people will not just feel limited to ask a question, but could also give their own impressions. And the second question is, doesn't the NATO alliance then need to do something? And of course, then if that's the question, what are the options and who's going to do it? So Peter, over to you. I apologize for going over.
Oh, no, that's fine. That was wonderfully done. I have a question from Bob Wagner, and I'll read it to you. What is standard Russian doctrine for tactical nuclear employment on the battlefield? And does that doctrine account for a positional fight? If not, do you know how to go ahead? Just answer that one.
I'm sorry, Peter. Can you just?
Bob Wagner said, "What is standard Russian doctrine for tactical nuclear employment on the battlefield? And does that doctrine account for a positional fight? If not, do we know how it's been adapted, or can we at least make an educated guess for positional warfare in Ukraine, or say in a protracted fight with NATO?"
Right. Yes. So let me work backwards. Yes, they do treat it, nuclear artillery in particular, as a weapon for positional fight. In fact, when they first put that field of that 240 millimeter mortar, it was essentially designed to mess up positional, to be a game changer for positional battle. And they felt that having enhanced radiation hurt the defender in a prepared defenses more than it did for in armored forces, who were protected, and secondly, who were moving. After the end of the Cold War, the Russians, for between 91 and actually it was with Les Aspin when he was chairman of the House Armed Services Committee on his first trip to Moscow. and that capacity of the Russian. This was right after the end of the Cold War, and so the Russians offered to at the General Staff Academy actually walk me through some of their exercises, and they basically at that point they'd taken NATO's doctrine and flipped it around. They were going to try and defend conventionally. If they couldn't, and felt outnumbered against NATO because their army had dropped from 5 million to 1 million, or their military, they were going to use nuclear weapons to offset their conventional shortage. What changes in 99 is the idea of adding a coercive element to not only to nuclear possession as well as nuclear use, and that can generally be associated with Putin. It's interesting when the Russians went into Crimea in 2014. It's not generally known. They put their boomers on alert. When in 2017 Zapad, they were playing conventional, and they played a U.S. global strike coming in to try and save the Baltics. And Putin was on TV pushing the button with a smile on his face, saying, "Okay, we're going nuclear." So I don't like the word doctrine in a doctrinaire sense. They have, I believe, a number of contingencies in which they can see using nuclear weapons. And just because they have them on a wide variety of platforms, probably have a wider range of contingencies they would use. I wouldn't get locked into, oh, yeah, yes, they do, or no, they don't. They're certainly aware of one of the things back in Zapad 81, their concept was with the Operational Maneuver Group was to hit NATO before its forces were prepared in positional positions. Hit the north and hit the south and avoid the two U.S. corps in the middle, and try to get as deep as possible early under the argument that NATO would then have trouble firing nuclear weapons in its own rear area. And it would actually increase their own survivability. So they've been playing with a number of issues on it. I hope that addresses it.
Yeah, it does, Phil. I have another question. What role did Yeltsin's decree of April 1999 play in the escalate to de-escalate formulation? Because he said, develop me battlefield nuclear weapons that are small, accurate, low yield, that I obviously can use on the battlefield, which is often, I find almost no reference to it in the arms control literature and in the literature about Russian doctrine. People have come back at General Hyten and others, Brad Roberts, for example, that talked about either escalate to de-escalate or escalate to win. They're talking about the same thing. And they were criticized for saying, oh, no, the Russians have not ever adapted anything like that. But the 1999 decree and what Mr. Putin did after he took over seems to indicate very strongly that this is exactly what they've done.
So what's interesting about 99 is I think the evidence is that Yeltsin, by the way, this canard about NATO enlargement threatening Russia. Yes. NATO did not do any major exercises. We had a counterterrorism exercise in the east, and they did a medical exercise. The whole idea of enlargement was to two things. One is get the East Europeans thinking, particularly mid-level diplomats and military, more in line with the West. And secondly, they had these huge bloated infrastructure. The amount of military equipment in Eastern Europe between the end of the Cold War and 1999 went down by 2/3. And there were no NATO offensive exercises. So Putin was he wanted to keep troops in along the Baltic coast in the Baltic republics. And Clinton was he felt Clinton was pushing him around and forcing him to get rid of. I think they move the air defense side at Sarme. So when he moves Putin from head of the Security Service to be chairman of the National Security Council. That's in the spring of '99. So Putin's innovations don't start with him being president. They start in the spring, and so
Okay.
when is Escalate to De-escalate published in Voyage Measle? And it's in the summer of '99. What are they doing in the summer '99? They're getting ready for Zapad '99 and that fall. What are they doing in Zapad '99? They're planning Escalate to De-escalate.
Interesting. Another question again from my friend, my president here, Jim Petrovsky. What plans does NATO have that you know of that would in fact use nuclear forces in response to a Russian use of nuclear forces? Have we even thought about that, or is it basically it's up to you, United States, you figure it out?
So I had a little comment in one of the slides. I go, NATO has not changed. NATO adopted flexible response under Military Committee 14/3 in 1967.
Right.
We have not had, so at the beginning of the Cold War, we had MC/1, and in the mid-50s, we had MC/2, in 67, we had MC. We have not changed it since. Now, you could argue, oh, well, we're being flexible. It's flexible. It's not, we're going to be flexible. But our nuclear thinking in the height of the latter half of the Cold War was caught up on the horns of the dilemma of our first use. We really haven't given lots of thought, in my opinion, to their first use.
Mm-hmm. I hear you.
Now, I'm sure General Breedlove's a good friend of mine. He was going to try and join us today. I'm sure that any number of SACers could say, "Oh, well, we had plans." I have no doubt that Mons has thought of a lot of different contingencies. But as an alliance, as a document in which you can get the alliance to agree on, we're still living with flexible response. And buried in flexible response is the assumption of us having first use.
Nuclear weapons.
Nuclear weapons. Right.
Theater or otherwise.
And us having the option of deliberate escalation, not responding.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it's time we rethink it. In some ways, it's an advantage, because if we don't have to carry around the onus of, oh, no, we're going to have to initiate nuclear fire, well, it's a hell of a lot easier to design a force to inhibit or to deal with the other side taking the initiative, but you damn well better not have that force be vulnerable and an invitation to preemption.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. There, in the current defense bill, there's money for developing the Navy launched cruise missile, but would be nuclear armed. And there's also discussion of putting long range strike capabilities aboard our theater aircraft. In your view, are either needed? And if developed, would they significantly help, whether you call it deterrence or whether you call it inhibition, keep Russia from, God forbid, using nuclear weapons in the theater?
Well, almost anything's better than supplementing what we have now with almost anything is better than not doing anything. I purposely didn't put Karber's list of
I hear you,
because I really wanted to foster, if we don't do it today, but get people thinking about what our options are. The submarines add survivability, and with cruise missiles, it can add a lot. There, in the defense guidance or the nuclear posture review of, I think it was last year's of either last year with Obama or early Trump, there was a proposal to have a nuclear submarines. By the way, which our arms control community had vehemently argued
Yes.
against. Not a bad idea. Is there a conventional alternative to nukes? Yes and no. Yes, there are things that long-range precision strike can do. But if you look at that escalate to de-escalate, the Russian side of that comparison, there's a little line in there that goes, and this is their quote: "The new revolution in military affairs is the combination of low-yield nuclear weapons with long-range precision strike."
Long-range precision strike that is nuclear capable.
Right.
Okay.
What's interesting, by the way, I've been looking at why the Russians have been so ineffective with all those Iskander hits. And I think the reason is that those systems were designed for a small nuclear weapon. So, the difference between hitting a supermarket and hitting a command and control point may only be 100 yards. So we see them come in and we go, "What are they doing hitting a nursery school?" But I suspect that their own accuracy, for whatever reason, whether it's poor targeting, whether it's MAB aids, but I think they were using low yield to offset the accuracy phenomenon, because they should have had a hell of a lot more impact on Ukraine than they had. I mean, it's taking its toll, but for all those hits.
Well, Phil, thank you. It's 11:03. We're a couple minutes over. I want to turn it over to either Jim Petrovsky, our president, if he has something he'd like to say, or Kimberly to say goodbye. Phil, this is an extraordinary amount of information. I hope you can share your slides with us, because there's just a huge amount of information. Some of it extraordinary, very useful. And I want to thank you and the Potomac Foundation for taking the time out of your schedule and coming and talking to us. And Kimberly, over to you and our president, if Jim is around, wants to say something.
Well, thank you. A special thank you to you, Dr. Karber. We really appreciate this time and helping us understand these important topics and bring them to a broader audience here at NIDS. If you're new to NIDS, we're a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to advancing peace and promoting stability through a strong national security and nuclear deterrent. We do this by offering a wide range of deterrence education, from live and virtual forums like this one to podcasts, publications, workshops, and courses through our NIDS Academy. Looking ahead, I mentioned earlier to mark your calendars for Dr. Don Cook, who will be addressing strategic stockpile stewardship in 2 weeks on Friday, so you can register for that. We have a full lineup of events and speakers each week, all through this fall and winter, so be sure that you and your colleagues are on that invitation list by emailing us at nids@thinkdeterrence.com. We'd love to have you help us grow our community, so please follow us on LinkedIn, X, Rumble, YouTube, and wherever you listen to your podcasts. Make sure to like and follow us to help us spread the word. And we hope you have a peaceful day. Thank you for being here. And this recording should be up by Monday.
Thank you.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you, Kimberly. Take care.